Hi, so welcome to week 5. The theme for this week is structure and organisation of the medieval university. For your video discussions this week, the main question that I've posted, which you're welcome to deviate from as long as it pertains to the readings, but the question I suggested for you is what similarities can we see with the structure and organisation of the medieval university compared with today's university. So I just want to run through some key points from your textbook and kind of explain very, very quickly how the different readings that I've posted on Moodle link together. So your textbook reading for this week was chapter 4, and this is about the university structure and organisation, and it's pretty well broken down, this chapter. I thought good headings, I like a good heading, but one thing I find pretty confusing, because I'm a visual learner, is the explanation of the structure of the two dominant types of university. So I made these little charts which helped me understand how it all fit together, and I thought it might help you guys as well. So especially for this, the Bologna type of university organisation, you read all these terms, and especially many of them are in Latin to make it even more complicated. And as a visual learner myself, I started to draw a chart, and it was just a scribble, and then I made it neater here. So hopefully this helps kind of help the structure of the University of Bologna sort of click in your mind. So you can see that you'll see between this slide and the next one, which is going to be of Paris, that there's commonalities between the two of them, but certainly Bologna is more complex. There's more subdivisions in Bologna. So Bologna and then Paris, much less complicated, a lot fewer lines for me to draw. So the Paris type is the one that took hold more, had a bigger impact. So you can see there's the different faculties, and that overlaps with what was going on in Bologna, but a lot fewer subdivisions in this Faculty of Arts. They just had 4 nations. So that's what the arrows are pointing to along the bottom here. So the nations are an interesting point, and several of your readings touch on this. I find it very interesting, and just to flag this to you, that medieval people had a very different concept to what we do today about nationality. So don't confuse nations for nationality. To a medieval person, their concept of place-based identity is drastically different from our own. They did not define themselves by nation-state, because the nation-state as we understand it today was actually only developing over the course of the Middle Ages. It really doesn't become the modern nation-state until after the Middle Ages, into the early modern period. So the term nation, if you're not careful, could be pretty misleading. If we went back in time and were able to interview medieval people and we asked them, where are you from? They wouldn't say France necessarily. Well, maybe France, but certainly they wouldn't say Italy. There's a good example. None of them would say, oh, I'm Italian. Instead, they would identify with a much smaller place, their city-state in the case of Italy. Or in the slide here for the Paris type, we've got Picardy and Normandy, and those are regions of France. Today, they're the regions of France, but they would have had their own fairly independent identity back in the Middle Ages. Likewise, if we went to Germany, modern day Germany, so the Holy Roman Empire back then, people would have felt a connection to a much smaller place. It's not a modern day nation state. So today we might be like, oh, I'm Irish or Canadian, etc. No concept really of that in the Middle Ages. The one thing that does kind of overarch all these smaller place-based distinctions is Christianity. If we ask them, and we push them, we're like, no, somewhere bigger than the region that you're from, you probably would get them to concede that they were from Christendom. And so the fact that medieval people felt that they were united by their common adherence to Roman Catholicism, that would be the higher unifying element. And obviously we're going to see a lot of that in universities, because the last few weeks we've been discussing about the religious role in the medieval university. So all that to say, don't confuse the nations for nation states. They're two different things. The nation state, by which we've got a strong centralized government, which of course many of our university students are going to end up working for, that is developing in this time period. So we cannot be as quick as simply to equate. All right, so what else do you have to look at this week? There's two primary sources in translation, obviously. I like both these primary sources. They're pretty quick to understand, but they use the terms from your textbook in context, and these terms like Dean and Bursar and Beatles and the rest. They use these terms and similar ones in the way that they were used. And sometimes I think getting a word in its original context helps things click for me. These are also good sources for the written forum questions that I post for this week. The second of the two shows how the structures spread. One of them is from the 13th century, one's from the 14th century. I'd also encourage you to think about who the authors of these two primary sources were. If you look at the authors, there's two different backgrounds there, and I want you to take this into consideration. Another article that I posted is from the 1960s, so it's a bit older, but what I liked is that it started out with a comparison between the medieval developments and the modern day incarnations of these university structures. And I thought it was a fairly easy read, well structured as well. So again, I would recommend that additional article that I linked to for use in the written forums this week. Another reading that I posted that conveys very effectively the connections between back then in the Middle Ages and today, right now, are the extracts that I scanned in from the Toswell book, the Medieval University Today. So that one will be really useful for the written forums, I think. But of course, as I said, you're welcome to deviate from the question that I suggested in the written forums, the video discussions. You're welcome to deviate from that suggested question, as long as it's something that's going to get conversation going that your classmates can respond to, and it's drawing from the readings. Another aspect of the readings that, again, I'm a visual learner and made more sense to me, and this ties in with our next week's theme, is like on page 137 on your textbook, it's talking about how buildings are becoming increasingly important to defining the institution of the university. Next week, we're talking about where the universities, and my plan is to have you look at some of the Google Street Views and Google cultural artifacts to do with the universities. But it's pretty hard being here, imagining exactly what they're talking about. So I picked out some pictures that are the same places as are mentioned in your textbook. So your textbook talks about the Spanish College, and indeed you've a reading about the nations at the Spanish College. The Spanish College is the same as the Colegio de España. So your textbook calls it the Colegio de España, and then your additional reading calls it the Spanish College. It's the same place. It's at Bologna. So this is actually what it looks like. Definitely a nice looking building. I think I could be inspired to study there quite happily. Another one that your textbook talks about was the Congregation House at the University of Oxford. So definitely very Gothic in appearance, and very church influenced in the architecture. Another one your textbook mentions, only this time from Spain, was the Las Escuelas from the University of Salamanca. Salamanca is one of the main medieval universities in Spain. So you can see a lot of the local architectural traditions coming through. I think those balustrades at the top honestly look like they've been added in a bit later. It doesn't look quite medieval, but very nice Moorish influence on the columns. One of your readings talks about courtyards and how courtyards help students feel like they were being shut off away from the outside world to focus on their studies. And certainly when you start Googling images of these medieval universities, courtyards are definitely a theme. So this illustrates that physical manifestation of the students' imagination, I think, really, really well. This one's from France. This is the Salle des Thés in Orléans. As your textbook mentioned, there's really very little early medieval university buildings from France, which is really sad. So this one looks really, it's important, obviously, it's in your textbook, but doesn't look kind of small and sad compared to the grand ones that I've just shown you, or even this one from Poland, the Collegium Maius from Krakow. Lovely bright red brick, and again, look, there's a courtyard, and very cloister appearance in these courtyards, evoking the feeling of a monastery, of a community that's away from the corruption of the world to focus on their studies. Is definitely what they were going for. So this also, as well as illustrating what your textbook was talking about this week, going to tie us in really nicely with our place-based examination next week. Another thing that your textbook talks about are academic insignia. Really hard to find good pictures of all of those, but here's some gowns to illustrate what I was talking about. Like, medieval people were pretty keen on being able to look at someone and know from where in the social hierarchy they came from. Increasingly over the course of the Middle Ages, they start introducing these things called sumptuary laws, and sumptuary laws were to dictate what people could or couldn't wear. So at an extreme, it's kind of like, oh, okay, only people from the very top class are allowed to wear pink, for example. Or if you watch The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu, you know, the women are all wearing different colours in that, like the handmaids are in red and the wives are in blues and greens. That's an example of a sumptuary law, using clothing to reflect people's social status. Medieval people are super keen on that. The Romans were as well. Medieval people are very keen on it. So your textbook talks about how they wanted students to be distinguishable as students. So one of their ways of doing this was to make them wear academic gowns. So these are from Cambridge University. On the left there is the BA gown for bachelors, and on the right is for the master's students. So you can see they actually have different sleeves on them, the idea being they're supposed to be recognizable and distinguishable from one another. So while these are obviously modern photographs, because we don't have photographs in the Middle Ages, Cambridge, as you know, is a medieval university, and so they've kept this tradition going from what their students used to do in the Middle Ages. So the one on the right there, the guy on the right actually has completely different sleeves. The one in the bachelor's gown on the left has got open sleeves, but the master's gown on the right, it's really hard to see, but he's kind of got a hole poking out halfway down. They're much more Harry Potter style gowns, I think is the untechnical way to describe it, but the one which will make most sense to you. So the last article that I posted to Moodle for you is a little bit silly. It's not meant to be scholarly. Don't be approaching it like, oh, this is just not a scholarly source. I just thought it was a fun way to round out the week. And that's the medieval back-to-school shopping list. What I'll say is don't bother with the suggested reading that they have in there about the letters back home, because we're actually going to look at that in more detail in a later week. So we're going to look at that and then discuss it in more detail. So if you read it now, it's going to be a bit of a spoiler alert, and we're going to have the opportunity to talk about it in more depth. But yeah, it was just a more light-hearted reading for you to do this week. So, okay, I'm going to leave you to it. That's how those readings fit in together. But I'd start off with the textbook this time round and then turn to the additional readings that I posted.